Imagine an Earth where the oceans boiled away completely, leaving behind a cracked, sizzling desert hotter than your oven, forever. What if continents were smothered under a silent, miles-thick blanket of fungus, a creepy, living carpet that choked out all other plants and animals for eternity? Picture a sky turned permanently poisonous, an orange-green haze where breathing meant instant death for any complex creature, locking life away in the deep, dark seas. Or consider a world where insects grew to be the size of cars, their hum a constant terrifying drone across a planet they alone ruled. Number 10. Earth's forever tiny town. What if nothing ever grew big again? Permian Extinction, or the Great Dying, was bad, really bad. Like almost everything died bad. Around 252 million years ago, about 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species took a permanent vacation. For a while after this devastation, the survivors were small. This is called the Lilliput Effect, named after the tiny people in Gulliver's Travels. Creatures that made it through were generally smaller than their pre-extinction relatives. It makes sense. Smaller things need less food, less oxygen, and can hide more easily when the world is falling apart. But what if this wasn't just a phase? What if the Lilliput Effect became permanent? Imagine a planet where the environmental pressures, like stubbornly low oxygen levels, persistently scarce food sources, or a climate that just wouldn't stabilize, kept life locked in miniature mode. For millions, even tens of millions of years, the rule was simple: stay small or die. On this alternate Earth, the land wouldn't see the rise of giants. The early synapsids, our distant animal ancestors, might have survived, but they'd remain mouse-sized, scurrying through the undergrowth of equally stunted flora. The archosaurs, the group that would give rise to dinosaurs and crocodiles in our timeline, would also be stuck in small gear. Think geckos as apex predators in some regions, perhaps. The great evolutionary arms race that often drives increases in size just wouldn't ignite because the resources weren't there to fuel it. Being big would be a fatal luxury. The forests, if you could call them that, would be low-growing affairs. Trees might only reach the height of bushes, their growth limited by poor soil, an unstable atmosphere, or continuous environmental stress. The whole landscape would feel hushed, scaled down. The mighty roar of a T-Rex would never echo, because the evolutionary path to such a creature was paved with resource abundance that, in this scenario, never returned. Oceans, too, would mirror this trend. Fish would remain small. The massive marine reptiles that eventually patrolled our Triassic and Jurassic seas wouldn't evolve. Coral reefs, if they recovered at all from the extinction's ocean acidification, would be built by tiny organisms, perhaps forming more delicate, smaller structures. The vibrant, bustling Lilliput, fueled by large plankton blooms, leading up to larger and larger predators, would be a non-starter. The long-term consequence? A planet with significantly reduced ecological complexity. Fewer niches, simpler food. Webs, kind of evolutionary innovation that often comes with increased size, and the pressures of predation between large animals might never occur. Brain development, which in some lineages is correlated with body size and complex environmental interaction, could stall. Earth would be a world of whispers, of tiny rustlings in the dirt, a planet perpetually stuck in a biological childhood, never reaching its full, diverse, and sometimes gigantic potential. It's a quieter, perhaps more fragile, version of life's story. Number 9. The frozen, then fried planet, a double whammy of doom. Permian extinction was largely driven by the Siberian traps, a gigantic volcanic event that pumped enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, cooking the planet. But volcanoes also pump out aerosols, tiny particles that can block sunlight. Usually, the warming effect wins out over long periods. But what if, in an alternate chain of events, the initial volcanic output was incredibly rich in sulfur dioxide and ash, far more than in our timeline? Imagine this. The great dying kicks off. Life is reeling. And then, instead of a rapid bake, Earth is plunged into a severe, prolonged volcanic winter. The sheer volume of sun-blocking particles thrown into the stratosphere overwhelms the initial greenhouse gas release. Global temperatures plummet. Ice sheets, usually confined to the poles, begin to creep downwards, expanding rapidly across the continents. Oceans cool dramatically. Life that survived the initial extinction event, already struggling in a changed world, now faces a new, icy threat. This isn't just a few bad winters. It's a deep freeze lasting thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. Pangaea, the supercontinent of the time, becomes a vast, ice-covered wasteland. The remaining terrestrial life, perhaps clinging on in small equatorial refuges, faces near impossible conditions. Marine life, already dealing with anoxic waters, now contends with rapidly cooling seas and expanding sea ice, further shrinking habitable zones. But this is a frozen, then fried scenario. What happens when those sun-blocking aerosols eventually settle out of the atmosphere after millennia of darkness and cold? The greenhouse gases, which were still being pumped out by the Siberian traps all along, are now unmasked. And there's a lot of them. Planet, weakened and simplified by cold, suddenly swings violently in the other direction. Temperatures don't just return to normal, they skyrocket. The ice sheets melt at a catastrophic rate, causing sea levels to rise rapidly and flood coastal areas. The fresh water pouring into the oceans could disrupt circulation patterns even more. The Earth, having endured a global winter, is now thrust into an extreme runaway greenhouse state, possibly even more intense than what happened in our timeline. Survivors of the deep freeze would be those adapted to cold and scarcity. Now, they're hit with unbearable heat. It's a 1-2 punch from which recovery would be incredibly difficult. Complex ecosystems, if any managed to survive the ice, would be obliterated by the sudden, intense heat. The planet would become a barren, scorching hothouse, perhaps with equatorial regions becoming lethally hot, far beyond the tolerance of most multicellular life. This double catastrophe would leave Earth exceptionally barren, resetting the evolutionary clock far more severely than the single, albeit massive, crisis of our own Permian extinction. It's a world tortured by extremes, offering little chance for life to find its footing. Number 8. The stagnant slime world. Evolution hides pause for eons. The Permian extinction was a profound filter, wiping out a huge percentage of complex life. But life, in our timeline, eventually bounced back, diversifying into new forms. Triassic period saw the rise of early dinosaurs and mammals. But what if the extinction was so thorough, so devastating, that it effectively lobotomized the biosphere? What if the environmental conditions that followed, extreme heat, ocean anoxia, acid rain, were not just temporary crises but persisted with such intensity and for such a long duration that they actively suppressed the recovery of complex multicellular life for an almost unimaginable stretch of time? Imagine a world where, for 50 million, 100 million, or even 200 million years after the great dying Earth remained a planet dominated by the simplest of survivors. The victors of this alternate Permian aftermath wouldn't be resilient vertebrates or adaptable arthropods, but rather microbial mats, algae, and perhaps a few hardy, simple burrowing worms or snail-like creatures in the mud. The grand tapestry of ecosystem we know, with their intricate food webs and diverse body plans, would simply fail to re-emerge. The oceans, instead of eventually re-oxygenating and clearing, might have remained largely anoxic and murky, suitable only for anaerobic bacteria and organisms that could tolerate toxic, sulfur-rich waters. The vibrant reefs, the schools of fish, the marine reptiles, none of them would get a second chance. The seas would be silent, perhaps shimmering with bacterial slicks, but largely devoid of the macroscopic life that defines our oceans. On land, the picture would be equally bleak. Perhaps no true forests would ever return. Instead, vast plains might be covered in hardy lichens, fungal crusts, and low-lying resilient plants that could barely cling to life in a harsh, unstable climate. Animal life, if present at all beyond the microscopic, would be small, unassuming, and slow-moving. No herds thundering across plains, no predators stalking through jungles, because those complex roles and the creatures that fill them require a richness and stability that this earth cannot provide. Evolution itself would seem to stall, or at least be confined to a very narrow track. Without the ecological niches and competitive pressures that drive diversification and complexification, life would remain simple. The spark of innovation that led to dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and eventually humans would be snuffed out before it could truly ignite. Earth would be a living planet, yes, but a deeply impoverished one, a pale shadow of its potential, stuck in a biological rut for a vast stretch of geological time. It would be a world of slime and stillness, a quiet testament to an extinction event that truly broke the back of complex evolution. Number 7. The insect overlords. A six-legged dynasty takes charge. During the Carboniferous period before the Permian, insects got big, really big. Think dragonflies with the wingspan of eagles, like Meganeura. This was partly due to higher oxygen levels. Permian extinction hit insects hard too, but they are famously resilient. Now, imagine a scenario where the extinction event decimated vertebrate life on land even more thoroughly than in our timeline, or where the recovery of vertebrates was significantly delayed or impaired. At the same time, perhaps oxygen levels, after an initial dip, stabilized at a level that wasn't quite high enough for giant vertebrates, but still advantageous for arthropod respiration, or certain insect groups developed even more efficient breathing. In this alternate Triassic with land vertebrates largely out of the picture or confined to tiny insignificant forms, insects face a power vacuum, and they fill it. Instead of the Lilliput Effect taking hold for them, some groups begin to radiate and, crucially, to grow. The ecological niches once occupied by medium and even large herbivores and carnivores are now open. Picture a world where the dominant land animals have 6 legs and exoskeletons. Giant beetles, perhaps the size of sheep or even small cars, become the primary herbivores, their powerful mandibles munching through the recovering, tough Permian flora. Praying mantises, scaled up to human size or larger, could become terrifying apex predators, their lightning-fast strikes unopposed by vertebrate competitors. Swarms of oversized locusts could strip landscapes bare, their buzzing wings a constant deafening roar. The skies wouldn't belong to pterosaurs or birds, but to even larger dragonflies or other winged insect forms, patrolling like biological aircraft. And colonies could evolve into superorganisms of unprecedented scale and complexity, their nests forming vast city-like mounds covering miles, their armies waging war with other colossal insect factions. The social structures of bees and wasps might scale up, leading to hive structures the size of buildings fiercely defended by swarms of giant stinging guardians. The soundscape of this world would be utterly alien, the clicking, whirring, and buzzing of billions of enormous insects. The flora itself might co-evolve in strange ways, perhaps developing incredibly tough defenses against these supersized grazers, or relying on giant insects for pollination in bizarre new symbiotic relationships. Our mammalian ancestors, the synapsids, might still exist, but they'd be tiny nocturnal creatures, living in the shadows forever, trying to avoid being stepped on or eaten by the true rulers of this world. The age of reptiles, and subsequently mammals, would never dawn. Instead, Earth would enter a prolonged age of giant insects. It's a chilling thought, a planet where humanity's ancestors remained insignificant vermin under the chitinous feet of a six-legged global empire. This isn't just a world with big bugs, it's a world defined by them, their biology and social structures shaping every ecosystem. Number 6. Oceans of pink death. The purple bacteria conquer all. The Permian Extinction caused widespread ocean anoxia, a lack of oxygen. This was bad news for most marine animals that breathe oxygen. But for some microbes, it was party time. In anoptic sulfur-rich waters, certain types of bacteria thrive, like purple sulfur bacteria and green sulfur bacteria. These organisms are photosynthetic, but they don't produce oxygen. Instead, they use hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell, in their photosynthesis. In our timeline, blooms of these bacteria, sometimes called pink tides or purple tides, due to their color, occurred during the extinction, poisoning the waters. Now, imagine this scenario became permanent and global. What if the conditions in the oceans, persistent anoxia, high levels of hydrogen sulfide bubbling up from the decaying organic matter on the seabed, and sufficient sunlight penetration favored these bacteria so completely that they outcompeted everything else in the photic zone, the sunlit top layer of the ocean, on a worldwide scale for millions of years? The oceans of this alternate Earth wouldn't be blue or green. They would be a shocking, eerie, vibrant pink or deep purple, stretching from horizon to horizon. This isn't a picturesque alien sea. It's a toxic soup. The hydrogen sulfide these bacteria use and sometimes release is incredibly poisonous to oxygen-breathing life. So any complex marine animals that survived the initial extinction, fish, mollusks, crustaceans, would find the surface waters utterly uninhabitable. They would be pushed into ever-shrinking pockets of marginally oxygenated water, perhaps in very shallow, agitated coastal zones or deeper, colder regions, if any oxygen remained there. The dominance of these sulfur bacteria would have cascading effects. By consuming hydrogen sulfide, they might, in some ways, slightly mitigate its buildup in the atmosphere. However, they don't produce oxygen. So the reoxygenation of the oceans, a critical step for the recovery of complex marine life in our timeline, would be severely hampered, if not stopped entirely. The surface waters teeming with these colorful but deadly microbes would form a barrier, preventing atmospheric oxygen from mixing effectively into the deeper ocean. Life in these pink death oceans would be a microbial world. Complex food webs would collapse. The base of the food chain would be the anoxygenic photosynthesizers. Perhaps some specialist microbes could graze on them, but the path to larger, more complex animals would be severed. No great marine reptiles, no sharks as we know them, no whales in the far future. The deep ocean might remain a dark, anoxic graveyard, with only specialist chemosynthetic life around vents. The smell of this world, near the coasts, would be overpowering, a constant stench of rotten eggs from the hydrogen sulfide. The beauty of the pink seas would be a deadly illusion. This alternate outcome is a planet where the oceans, the cradle of life, become a vast, beautiful but profoundly inhospitable domain, locked in a state that actively prevents the flourishing of the kind of marine biocurvity we cherish. It's a world where the simplest life forms not only survived, but took over, turning the oceans into their toxic kingdom. Number 5. The never-ending night, when the volcanic winter lasts for generations. The Siberian traps were bad. Gigantic lava flows, greenhouse gases, but volcanic eruptions also blast colossal amounts of ash and sulfur aerosols high into the atmosphere. These particles can block sunlight, leading to a volcanic winter. Usually, these effects are temporary, lasting a few years, maybe a decade for super eruptions. But what if the Siberian traps, in an alternate, even more catastrophic version of their eruption cycle, spewed out an unfathomable quantity of these sun-blocking particles continuously for decades, or even centuries? Imagine an Earth where the sun becomes a faint, ghostly disk in a perpetually murky, dust-choked sky. Or worse, it vanishes completely for years at a time behind an impenetrable veil of volcanic debris. Daylight, when it occurs, is a dim, reddish twilight. Night is absolute, a profound blackness unbroken by stars or moon, both obscured by the stratospheric dust. Global temperatures plummet, not just for a few seasons, but for generations. This isn't a short, sharp shock. It's a new, dark, freezing normal. Photosynthesis on land largely grinds to a halt. Plants unable to get enough light wither and die on a massive scale, from the mightiest trees to the smallest blades of grass. Only the hardiest, slowest growing plants, perhaps those with large underground energy stores or those capable of long periods of dormancy, might have a sliver of a chance in the briefest, dimmest periods. Herbivores, their food sources gone, would starve. Carnivores would follow soon after. Complex terrestrial ecosystem built up during the Permian would utterly collapse into a barren, frozen, dark wasteland. In the oceans, phytoplankton, the base of marine food webs, would suffer a similar fate in the sunlit zones. Their demise would cascade upwards, leading to mass starvation throughout the marine realm. Perhaps only life around hydrothermal vents in the deep, dark ocean, which relies on chemical energy rather than sunlight, would continue relatively undisturbed, an isolated oasis of warmth and activity in a dying world. Humanity's distant ancestors, the small synapsids that survived the Permian extinction in our timeline, would face impossible odds. How do you find food in eternal darkness and freezing cold? Perhaps only the smallest, most versatile scavengers, or those capable of hibernating for incredibly long periods, could even dream of surviving. But for generations, the genetic bottleneck would be extreme. When, or if, the volcanic activity finally subsided and the skies began to clear, it would be to a world almost entirely reset. The few survivors emerging from this prolonged artificial night would find a planet scoured of much of its former biodiversity. The recovery would be incredibly slow, starting from the most basic, resilient organisms. This scenario isn't just an extinction event, it's the Great Dying, followed by the Great Darkness, a profound and extended smothering of the planet's ability to support light-dependent life, potentially setting back the clock on complex evolution by tens of millions of years, or even leading to different ephemerophorife made it through. Number 4. The toxic sky. Earth's air becomes permanently unbreathable. Permian extinction saw the release of massive amounts of nasty gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. These made the air pretty awful for a while. But what if the scale and composition of volcanic outgassing, combined with the mass death and decay, permanently altered Earth's atmosphere, making it toxic to most complex land animals for millions of years? Imagine an atmosphere where levels of hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, or other volcanic poisons remained consistently high, far above lethal thresholds for creatures with lungs like ours or those of our Permian ancestors. The sky itself might take on a sickly orange-green or yellowish hue from the chemical haze. Breathing the air on the surface would mean a quick, agonizing death. In this grim alternate reality, land vertebrates that survived the initial die-offs would face an insurmountable barrier to recovery. Any creature attempting to live on the surface would be poisoned. Evolution might favor creatures with incredibly efficient, sealed respiratory systems, or perhaps those that could somehow neutralize the toxins. But these are complex adaptations that take time to develop, time that these animals might not have. So, where would life go? Perhaps some creatures could find refuge in cave systems with isolated air pockets, or high in the mountains, if the densest, most toxic gases settled in low-lying areas. These would be marginal, fragmented habitats. The vast majority of Pangaea's surface would be a death zone. The real sanctuary might be the oceans, or at least parts of them, if the oceans didn't also become entirely innocuous. As in other scenarios, marine life might persist, especially if water could buffer or absorb some of the atmospheric toxins. Perhaps life on land would be forced into a full retreat back to the water, with some terrestrial lineages readapting to aquatic or semi-aquatic lifestyles to escape the poisonous air. This could lead to a very different evolutionary trajectory for vertebrates. Plant life would also struggle. While some plants are more tolerant to toxic gases than animals, persistently high levels of sulfur dioxide, for example, create intense acid rain and directly damage plant tissues. Forests would be stunted, diseased, or non-existent in many regions. The entire terrestrial ecosystem would be suppressed, not by lack of food or by temperature, but by an atmosphere that was actively hostile to respiration. The long-term impact would be an Earth where the land remains largely barren and lifeless, or populated only by extremely specialized extremophile organisms, perhaps some insects or microbes, that could tolerate the toxic air. The grand diversification of land vertebrates, dinosaurs, mammals, birds, might never happen. Evolution's stage would be confined primarily to the aquatic realm. Our planet, with its vast continents, would have a breathable atmosphere only in its distant past and perhaps its far future, with a long toxic intermission where the surface was silent and unlivable for air-breathing animals. Number 3. The fungal nightmare. Continents smothered in a never-ending bloom. Right after the Permian Extinction, with so many plants dead and decaying, fungi had a field day. Fossil evidence shows a fungal spike, a massive proliferation of fungal spores and mycelia across the globe. They were the great decomposers of a dead world. In our timeline, this fungal dominance was temporary. Plants eventually recovered, and ecosystem rebalanced. But what if the fungi never relinquished their hold? Imagine a world where the environmental conditions post-extinction, perhaps a perfect storm of moisture, abundant dead organic matter, and a weakened plant kingdom that couldn't fight back, allowed fungi to not just bloom, but to become the dominant life form on land permanently. This isn't just a world with more mushrooms. This is a planet where continents are carpeted, perhaps even smothered, by vast, thick, interconnected fungal networks. Think of landscapes dominated by towering fungal structures, perhaps not like familiar mushrooms, but bizarre, colossal growths reaching hundreds of feet into the air, forming eerie, silent forests. The ground itself would be a living mat of mycelia meters thick, actively breaking down any organic matter that falls, but also potentially outcompeting or parasitizing any new plant life that tries to gain a foothold. Plant recovery would be crippled. Seeds might struggle to germinate in fungus-choked soil. Seedlings would be quickly overwhelmed by fast-growing, aggressive fungal hyphae, The few plants that could survive might be those that formed strange, perhaps subservient, symbiotic relationships with the dominant fungi, or those that were themselves partly fungal. True forests, grasslands, and diverse plant ecosystems as we know them would fail to re-establish. What about animals? Any land animals that survived the initial extinction would find themselves in a bizarre, alien world. Herbivores would have little to eat besides the fungi themselves, which might be poor in certain nutrients or even toxic. The very ground they walked on would be alive, potentially trying to decompose them too. Scavengers might do well for a while on the dead from the extinction, but then what? The entire food web would be warped, centered around this relentless, pervasive fungal kingdom. The air would be thick with spores, potentially causing respiratory problems for any air-breathing creatures. The visual landscape would be one of muted, earthy tones, perhaps punctuated by bizarrely colored fruiting bodies. It would be a quiet world, without the rustle of leaves or the calls of many animals, replaced by the subtle, pervasive activity of fungal growth and decomposition. This kingdom of fungi would represent a profound evolutionary dead end for many other lineages. Without a robust plant base, complex animal ecosystem cannot develop. The synapsids and diapsids that led to mammals and dinosaurs might dwindle and vanish, unable to cope in a world not of green plants, but of pervasive, all-consuming fungus. Earth would become a giant, eerie compost heap. A planet ruled not by tooth and claw, but by the silent, relentless spread of mycelium. Number 2. The million-year acid rain hell. Continents dissolving into barrenness. The massive volcanic eruptions of the Siberian traps didn't just release greenhouse gases. They also spewed colossal amounts of sulfur dioxide and chlorine into the atmosphere. When these gases mix with atmospheric water, they form sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid, the main components of acid rain. After the Permian Extinction, there was indeed a period of intense acid rain. But what if this wasn't a short-lived crisis? What if the scale of volcanism, or the specific chemistry of the eruptions, led to a scenario where intensely acidic rain fell almost continuously across the globe for hundreds of thousands, or even a million years? Imagine a world under a constant corrosive drizzle. Rainwater, not with a neutral phos, but with the acidity of vinegar, or even lemon juice, or worse. This isn't just bad for your garden. It's catastrophic for the entire planet. On land, this hyper-acidic rain would strip away vegetation. Plant leaves would be chemically burned and destroyed. Root systems would be damaged as the soil itself becomes incredibly acidic, leaching away essential nutrients and releasing toxic heavy metals. Forests would die and dissolve. Grasslands would turn into barren mud. The very rock of the continents would begin to weather and dissolve at an accelerated, alarming rate. Mountains would visibly erode within generations. Limestone landscapes would fizz away. The surface of Panga would become a scarred, etched wasteland. Rivers and lakes would become acidic traps. Any aquatic life that survived the initial extinction event would be faced with water so corrosive it could dissolve shells and exoskeletons and make osmoregulation, the balance of water and salts in a body, impossible for most organisms. Freshwater ecosystem would collapse entirely, becoming sterile, acidic pools. The oceans would not be spared. While the vastness of the ocean can buffer some acidity, a million years of highly acidic rain pouring off the dissolving continents would overwhelm this capacity, particularly in coastal regions and surface waters. Ocean acidification would become extreme, far worse than anything predicted for modern climate change. Organisms that build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, corals, mollusks, many types of plankton would find it impossible to do so. Their shells would literally dissolve. This would devastate marine food webs from the bottom up. The few survivors on land might be creatures that could seek deep shelter in caves if the caves themselves weren't dissolving too fast, or organisms with incredible acid resistance. Perhaps some extremophile microbes or very specialized insects with waxy protective coatings, or very specialized insects with waxy protective coatings. But for vertebrates, for our ancestors, this would be an almost unsurvivable planet. The long-term consequence of such a prolonged acid bath would be a world stripped bare, its soils impoverished, its waters toxic, its biodiversity reduced to almost nothing. Recovery, once the acid rain finally stopped, would be from an incredibly low point on a geologically and biologically scarred planet. It would be an Earth that had been chemically flayed, taking an immense amount of time to heal, if it ever fully could. Number 1. Venus Earth. The runaway greenhouse that never stopped. Permian extinction was driven by a massive greenhouse effect caused by volcanic CO2. Temperatures soared, but Earth's climate system has feedback loops. In our timeline, eventually, processes like silicate weathering drew CO2 out of the atmosphere over millions of years, and life recovered, albeit slowly. What if the initial pulse of CO2 from the Siberian traps was even larger? Or what if critical negative feedback loops failed? Or positive feedback loops, like the release of methane from melting permafrost or seabed clathrates, were far stronger and more sustained? What if Earth tipped into a true irreversible runaway greenhouse effect, similar to what happened on Venus? This is the ultimate catastrophic outcome. Imagine global average temperatures not just rising by 5 or 10 degrees Celsius, but by 30, 50, or even hundreds of degrees. The oceans would begin to heat up relentlessly. At first, this would cause even more water vapor, a powerful greenhouse gas itself, to enter the atmosphere, accelerating the warming. Coral reefs would bleach and die instantly. Marine life would boil in the tropical seas. As temperatures continued to climb, the oceans themselves would start to evaporate at a massive rate. Coastal areas would see sea levels rise dramatically from thermal expansion, then fall as the water turned to atmospheric steam. Eventually, the oceans would literally boil away into the atmosphere. Earth, the blue planet, would lose its most defining feature. The surface would become a cracked, superheated, desiccated desert under a crushing, dense atmosphere made mostly of carbon dioxide and steam. Surface temperatures would reach hundreds of degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Any life that hadn't already perished would be incinerated. There would be no liquid water anywhere on the surface. The rocks themselves would bake and transform under the extreme heat and pressure. The vibrant, dynamic Earth system of plate tectonics, weathering, and erosion as we know it might even seize up or change radically. The atmosphere would be a thick, soupy, hellish orange sky, perhaps with clouds of sulfuric acid, similar to Venus today. There would be no escape, no refuge. Life, if any survived at all, would be confined to extremophile microbes deep underground, if even they could withstand the internal heat of such a planet, or perhaps high in the atmosphere, if any viable niches existed there. But complex life, multicellular life, anything resembling animals or plants, would be an impossibility. This wouldn't be a temporary state. Once a planet like Earth enters a true runaway greenhouse, it's believed to be a one-way trip. The mechanisms that could cool it down are overwhelmed. Earth would become Venus's twin sister, a sterile, scorching, uninhabitable rock. The entire experiment of complex life on Earth, which had been unfolding for billions of years, would come to a permanent, fiery end. All the potential for dinosaurs, mammals, humans, civilizations, all of it vaporized along with the oceans. This is the ultimate silence, the ultimate desolation, a catastrophic outcome that erases not just species, but the very conditions for life as we understand.